I'm here in the county of Florence County, South Carolina, to tell the story of Wee Gaskins, the most infamous serial killer that South Carolina has in their history. And by telling his story, I should tell a little bit about product and process killers. Process killers value torture. These are people who are sadistic. And product killers are people like Jeffrey Dahmer who only value the bodies. But it would appear that Wee Gaskins tried to make himself into a process killer, but only ever really killed for business. And at least all of the confirmed kills that we have are people who double-crossed him in a business sense, apart from one woman who he killed out of racial hatred. And he lived here for a long period of time in Prospect, South Carolina. And it was here that he was actually found with all of these bodies in his backyard. The so-called coastal kills, of which he claims there were more than 100, were never found, and never there was any evidence found that would claim that he actually went out and committed all of these horrible, torturous kills that he claimed to have done. And he probably did this because, in reality, he was 5'4", and in the prison system, he would have been a very easy target for a lot of bad things. And by putting this evil reputation to him, he immediately gained a respect amongst his fellow inmates. But nowadays, Prospect Crossroads is just Prospect, and it's a small suburb, a rural community just outside of Lake City, which is the area where Pee Wee relates in his book, Final Truth. He first realized, by seeing a snake eat a rat that wasn't even hungry, that he identified with the snake. And this was at a carnival in Lake City, just a few miles north of Prospect, South Carolina. And nowadays, there's no real connection to Pee Wee Gaskin. There could be a museum or some kind of a tourist information center, but naturally, the people here just mostly want to be left alone. But anybody who's asked will tell you, as I was told, that they often saw Pee Wee driving through in his hearse, which he would joke about fairly regularly. And he claims to have gotten his start riding along the highways and picking up women, asking them for sex. They would often reject him, and finally he said that he exploded on one and killed her in a way that I won't even specify, but he used an 11-inch knife, and he disemboweled her and dunked her body in the water, weighted down with a log until the bubbles stopped rising. And seeing the swamps around Prospect, South Carolina is a little unnerving. You know, how many people are out there in those swamps? But just about 3 minutes north of Prospect is this church where his mother is buried, a woman by the name of Yulia Parrott. And Yulia had a habit of sleeping with men she was not married to. And back in the time that Pee Wee Gaskins was born, this was a very disrespected thing. So much so that the children were often looked down on and treated essentially as just there. People didn't pay attention to the children, and they didn't receive the kind of education they needed growing up. So when Pee Wee became a troublemaker, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy where people just began to treat him like a social pariah and look down on him. And he first got his trouble right here, actually just across the road. It's the Browntown Museum, which shows some of the very rural country living lifestyle that you would find in Florence County. And people started treating him as an outcast, and he formed the Trouble Trio, who would maraud through these small communities, burning down barns and stealing property, and eventually it culminated in the rape of one of the trio's sisters, and they were strung up upside down in the barn and beaten. And the third boy, his father was a criminal himself, held a shotgun on the front porch and prevented the beating from happening, and he escaped, but the Trouble Trio more or less split up. And here, a little bit to the north, is the grave of Henry Gaskins. Now, Henry is claimed to be Pee Wee's father. As I mentioned earlier, Yulia Parrott was sleeping with a lot of different men, and Henry Gaskins was probably one of these men, but never really was a force in Pee Wee's life. And he only found out his last name was Gaskins himself, Pee Wee did, when he was on trial, or his mother was in the courtroom, for some of the actions that he and his Trouble Trio were committing. And it was only then that he took the name Gaskins, although some people have remarked that he probably took the name in order to latch on to some of his reputation, because Henry Gaskins was well respected in the community. He was a poet, he was college educated, and he owned a business. But actually, just a few miles to the east of the cemetery where his supposed father is buried is a Confederate monument to a prison system. And I mention this because Pee Wee mentions it in his book that he was educated in the reform school, basically as a juvenile delinquent, and it was right on the cemetery road. And the Confederate memorials here are a little dark. They have a dark history to them because there was a prison camp for Union soldiers. And this was at the very end of the Civil War. And as you can imagine, the living conditions were just brutal. And these Confederates are memorialized, or they were at the time, quite a bit more than the Union soldiers who died in the camp were. And I thought that that was a very bit of very dark history. But here, about a mile east of the cemetery, is the home of Henry Gaskins, or the home of Pee Wee's father. And Pee Wee never really knew this man. I wasn't able to find any indication that they ever talked, or he played even a minute role in Pee Wee's life. But he lived until the 1990s, which I thought was very interesting. He lived up until very recent times, but he was living in this house when he died.
Charles Manson, a lot of these like 70s, a lot of these.
And this is the area just to the west of the school that he was in. And in his book, Final Truth, he describes quite a few brutal gang rape scenes where he claims that 50 boys were on top of him, basically. And he would escape through this field and into the woods because it wasn't very well guarded. But when people came to search for him, they would use basically chain gangs, and they would find the boys as they escaped, basically just walking out. And he was forced to dig ditches in the South Carolina heat about a mile long before filling them up. And here's a monument to the Confederate prison guards who guarded the Union soldiers at one of the most brutal camps in the South. And in this direction, actually, about a mile down the road, is the school that he was forced through. And that school had a lot of very dark memories. I think that it turned him from, just a troublemaker into a total psychopath. But these are some of the conditions that would have been seen at this camp. And these are survivors of Andersonville, which was a camp that had a similar reputation. And you can see the darkness of this place. And this is actually the reform school. It still exists, but it's still a juvenile center. And I didn't really have any desire to go in there poking around with a camera because they're just serving their time. But this is a very interesting place called the Lenore Store, probably one of the oldest family owned businesses in America. And it was here that Carrie Lenore ran into trouble with the law because she claimed that a recent found murder victim named Peg Cuttino was seen at her store one day after she was reported missing. Now, the police blamed this murder on somebody else. They blamed it on a mentally ill serial killer. But the woman, Carrie, claims that she saw Peg in there the day after, didn't match with the serial killer's MO, and that she saw her with two boys who appeared very excited. So the boys would have probably kidnapped her, killed her because her body was found in the woods by airmen at Shaw Air Force Base, and brought her out of the community because she claims these boys later came back without the girl and they seemed in a good amount of stress before driving off. And she displayed autopsy photos of Peg Cuttino, which caused a stir in the community. But nobody in the community really believed that Peg Cuttino was killed either by the killer that the police implicated or later by Wee Gaskins, because Gaskins actually claimed credit for this kill. And there's a little bit of evidence because, and also this is the killer who claimed to have killed her. That was the one implicated by the police. But Gaskins was living and working on the same road, and it was down this road where he probably would have picked up Peg Cuttino. And she was actually only 13 years old, and she was the daughter of some politicians in South Carolina. So, and she was also a very pretty white girl. So you can see that her murder immediately got investigated, and immediately the police wanted to blame, I believe, a man named Pierce or something along those lines. But immediately they picked a guy with basically 60 IQ that had killed a bunch of people, and they were like, case closed. Gaskins claims credit, but Carrie Lenore still believes that it was the two boys who drove through and basically, in a highway raid, took her and brought her to the woods and brutally murdered her. And these are some photos of Gaskins himself leading police through the woods to find bodies which were never really found. All that was ever found were the bodies in his backyard and a few other dead bodies, which he claimed credit for, but these weren't found as a direct result of him leading them there. And these are just some of the fields near the Lenore store. just behind Shaw Air Force Base. I was actually able to hear jets flying over, F-16s, from here. And this is actually a photo of Peg Cuttino. And she was buried in her family plot not too far away from there in the town of Sumter, which is where Wee Gaskins was living at the time. He worked for a car stripping business and a mechanic shop. And he was doing a bunch of odd jobs around the town, so even though he liked to claim credit for a lot of people, specifically if it got him a lot of attention, it's not too far of a stretch to believe. But here's his first confirmed kill. Janice Kirby and her friend Patty Allsbrook were both teenagers, and Janice Kirby here is buried in Florence, South Carolina. They both put up a fight. Basically, the story goes that Gaskins walked into a popular eating place for a bunch of young girls just after high school got out, and saw that his niece was there, and she was very sick. She was throwing up. She'd had too much to drink. Gaskins was also probably just there to try to pick up girls. And he decided to take them both in the car, bring them out to a tenant house, and rape them. And this rape eventually turned into a murder because he figured that he would beat them because they resisted, and then at the point of beating them with a pistol they were already half dead. So this falls more in line with the beginnings of a serial killer. They kill somebody because basically in the commission of another crime, and they realize that the thrill from that is the thing that really keeps them going, that can't be compared to anything else in their criminal enterprise. And she is buried somewhere. Allsbrook is in this cemetery, and it's a very large cemetery. I wasn't able to find the grave itself, but if you are in the local area of Sumter, you can talk to the office just behind this Jesus statue. They'll help you find it. I was just unable to visit because it was closed at the time and it was a little bit later in the day. And the two girls lived in a suburb called Concord of the town of Sumter. And this is another one of those rural areas where they would be congregating at the church, at the community center, or the baseball field that I show here before going off to school or into town for basically weekends and days off. And these rural backcountry roads, there's something a little bit darker about them. I always thought, especially after seeing, season one of True Detective, South Carolina is a pretty creepy place. It's a beautiful place, and I love it, but it's also got a very dark kind of vibe here.
A quarter mile, make a U-turn at Dent Lane.
And right now we are driving up to the town of Sumter to tell a little bit more about where Gaskins lived and worked, because I actually was able to talk to somebody over Facebook about their time working with him at Fort Roofing, and I thought that was very interesting. The guy basically said he didn't know that Gaskins did anything, and he actually seemed at the time to be a pretty good friend, even though he was a little bit wild. And here, a stop along the way is the old community church just outside of the town where Patty Allsbrook would live, along with Janice Kirby. This is the town of Sumter, and you can see Shaw Air Force Base there. Gaskins said that he, as a child, would frequent a lot of the prostitutes around Shaw, and this taught him to disrespect people who served as sex workers. And this road actually is leading right on up to the old Fort Roofing where he would work. And from what I was told, there was another guy who at the time was 15 years old. He knew Gaskins as a friend. He said he was a small guy and he never let anybody in the shop pick on him, and he never really knew that Gaskins did any of those horrible things. Of course, he says that Gaskins, again, a little bit crazy, but didn't know that he was a killer at the time. At the time, everybody just thought that he was a little bit of a weird short dude, and of course you'd never believe that somebody has the evil in them to do what Gaskins did, and especially to do what he said he did. And this is a screen cap of the kind of relation that he told me. It was a business area, and it was out of here that he likely ran a lot of his criminal enterprises. Gaskins did, and this is now Thompson Custom Fabrication. But at the time, this was called Port Roofing, and they would strip and sell cars out of here. Gaskins would basically rob the cars, steal, and bring up the scrap that couldn't be traced back to the criminal enterprise to the shop here where he would make a profit. And looking just over here, if you made a left on that road, you would be in downtown Sumter. But the woods around it are very dark and good for hiking if you've got a good deal of mosquito repellent. Actually, here we have the grave of Silas Barnwell Yates, who was killed in a murder for hire scheme. He was 45 years old, and Gaskins claims to have killed him with a karate chop to the neck. John Owens, pictured here, paid Gaskins $1,500 to kill him, and Suzanne Owens was only released a few years ago. And this was basically his ex-wife was in a conflict with him, and the ex-wife's new husband paid Gaskins to make him no longer a problem anymore. And this is just south of the Pinedale Pentecostal Holiness Church. It's about a mile or two down the road, but it's the graveyard of the Pentecostal church. And I noticed that a lot of these victims were buried in Pentecostal churches because this kind of evangelical Christianity is very, very popular in the Deep South. And they actually have a little radio station right next to the main church. Actually, a lot of churches out here do. And this is a photo of Walter Neely, a ex-con who helped out Gaskins in a lot of his crimes. And the involvement of Neely was actually brutal and a fascinating story to analyze all its own. But essentially, Gaskins led Neely to where he had buried his wife and a couple of his friends and said that they crossed him in business and gave Neely a series of test questions to see if Neely would freak out. And he said, well, now that my wife is gone, I don't see any use in freaking out over it. And that answer basically it appeased Gaskins enough to let Neely live. So as soon as Gaskins was caught, Neely was more than happy to bring the police to the location of Gaskins' private graveyard. And a lot of the people which were lost in this graveyard, still missing at the time, were finally given Christian burials here at the Methodist Church in South Carolina, just along the coast, actually. And you'll see here Neely's ex-wife, Diane Bellamy Neely. And Diane was the estranged wife of Walter Neely. And she was killed not because Walter wanted her dead, she was killed because she threatened to call the police on Gaskins for letting basically teenagers and children have sex in his house. He also killed her boyfriend at the same time. She's not buried in the cemetery, but he asked for money to pay legal fees relating to a court case because he was caught stripping cars, and Gaskins didn't want to be caught with that. Also buried in this graveyard is Dennis Bellamy, who was 27 at the time, and he was shot with his 15-year-old half-brother John Henry Knight over a gun-running scheme. Essentially, Dennis Bellamy was led into the woods, and Gaskins said, "Hey, I hid the guns out behind my little house here. Come take a look at him." And he shot him in the back of the head. And then he let his brother out, John Henry Knight, and shot the 15-year-old as well in the back of the head. And these were Gaskins' last confirmed kills, John Henry Knight specifically in October 10th, 1975. However, he did kill one more person in prison in a very complex scheme which involved rigging explosives to the phone system. And when this kill was successful, they were able to try him again for murder and sentence him to death, which at the time he was convicted was an illegal thing. It was unconstitutional to have the death sentence. But now that he killed somebody in 1991, they found it fit to finally put him to death.